We're with Joseph Majkut, Director of Policy at the Niskanen Center, a Libertarian think tank. Joseph, you could maybe give me a sense of the Libertarian view on climate policy and climate science.
It's a good question. I think there is the answer of what the present day Libertarian view on climate change is and what we think it ought to be, sort of a mass versus correct perspective. I mean, there's no obvious Libertarian perspective, but we think a lot of the things that Libertarians hold important, the protection of private property, the protection of lives, those things which the Libertarians are willing to consign government responsibility to, are threatened by climate change, and therefore there is a strong case for government intervention, judicious government intervention, to respond to the risks of climate change.
Okay, now you talk a lot about the divergent public views on climate change from those of politicians. I mean, could you maybe describe that a little bit, and why do you suppose that is?
Sure, I think that, it's no secret that particularly politicians for the Republican Party in America reject, to some degree, that there is risks associated with climate change worthy of acting on in terms of reducing CO2 emissions, making public investments in energy research, science, or various adaptation activities, such as building seawalls. I think there is a few reasons. The path dependency of the politics of the American system, which have led to the situation in which we find ourselves, and it's on us to work to bring people back into the fold.
And you are trying to pull people back into the fold. You're focusing your efforts on the politicians, on the elites?
Right, yes.
Public.
The Niskanen Center in general, as a public advocacy group, focuses our efforts on elite opinion rather than public opinion. We think that the leading indicator of public policy change is consensus among those people who make decisions, elected politicians themselves, their staffs, and the people they look to for good advice when confronted with issues on which they will vote.
Okay, and how successful have you been so far, or that view of the issue been so far, in convincing some Republicans and conservatives to take climate change seriously?
We've had a measurable effect. We're not the only group that works to change Republican opinion on climate, but over the few years that the Niskanen Center has been around, we've seen an increased interest on the part of Republican legislators to think about climate change as an issue, to understand the risks associated with climate change, and to think about solutions that are ideologically and politically consistent for them. Not all those people are exactly where the Niskanen Center is in terms of the pace and scale of reducing CO2 emissions that we would like to see, or the policy instruments that we want to see them exercise. But the conversation has certainly begun, and it's a far different place than it was a few years ago.
Okay, and what are the most important policy actions that Congress could take to support doing something about changing climate?
In my opinion, what we need to do is find a way to fairly, judiciously, and consistently apply pressure on CO2 emissions. And the way the Niskanen Center would like to do that is by placing a price on CO2 via a carbon tax, and instead of the regulatory interventions that are currently obligated for the government, right? The Clean Air Act says, and judicial interpretation of the Clean Air Act says, that the government must act to reduce CO2 emissions if it finds that they are dangerous. It has found that they are dangerous. The Trump administration can choose to do that slowly or without a lot of ambition. And what we want to see is this process to move toward a market-based model where Congress decides the ambition that we should seek and agrees that we can fairly reduce CO2 emissions using a pricing system instead of this sort of regulatory back and forth.